Just to start, I think most of this will be in English, also some Russian. I tried to learn Russian from the age of 13 years old. It went very badly. I decided to stick with my economics, and I think if you listen to my Russian, you would agree I made the right decision doing that. This panel is addressing the issue of protectionism. Mrs. Lagarde yesterday said this is the single most important threat to the world economy. So to talk about this, we have James McCormack, the global head of ratings at Fitch. Jörg Gesser may join us from Switzerland. He's the State Secretary for International Finances. He's not here just yet. Alexei Mordashov from Severstal. We've got Pavel Kadochnikov, Center for Strategic Research. We've got Kopu Kun from Singapore. We're all sorry to hear about the summit news to do with Singapore. Frank Schauf on my left, and CEO of the Association of European Business. We then have Sergei Storchak, Deputy Finance Minister of Russia. Ksenia Yudaeva, the Central Bank of Russia, First Deputy Governor. Andy Shi, famous economist, quite controversial on China. Alexei Yakovitsky, Global CEO of VTB, thank you very much. And finally, almost needs no introduction, Oleg Vyugin, Chairman of SAFMA. If I can start with the presentation, which I think I'm going to take a slightly controversial view and say that we've been here before on trade wars. But let's have a quick look at the situation right now. The trade deficit there, America's trade deficit with China, is shown on the left-hand side in black. And you can see that trade deficit has been getting bigger and bigger forever. On the right-hand side, you can see as a percentage of GDP, the American trade deficit is worth 2% of GDP with China. We can see why Trump is worried, particularly because in his first year as US president, the trade deficit got bigger and reached a record high. Trump in 2016 said he would deal with the trade deficit with China, but it's got bigger in 2017. Who should worry about American protectionism? In emerging markets, the red is the amount of your exports that go to America. There's only one country which has to be really scared of American protectionism, that's Mexico. And they are very scared. What is a threat to us all is if a trade war between America and China hits Chinese growth. Because if we look at how important China is, on the left-hand side, it's emerging markets. On the right-hand side, frontier markets. Many emerging markets now export 15, 20, 25% of exports go to China. So if anything goes wrong with China, that matters more to emerging markets than America itself. So this, I think, is the threat. Now, I'm not going to read out all of these lines. What's important here is that we've been here before. When Reagan came to power, he talked about unfair trade. He introduced limits on imports of Japanese cars in 1981, quotas on Korean machine tools in 1982, a 45% tariff on Japanese motorbikes in 1983. In 1984, he put pressure on Japan to stop selling so much steel to America. In 1986, there was a conflict over semiconductors. In 1987, 100% tariff on Japanese televisions. My point is that we are only 1 year, 1.5 years into Trump's term in office. Every US president gets re-elected unless in his first term he has a recession. So there is a good chance that Trump will be president until 2024, and that we will have 6-7 more years of this protectionism. So what did this do? What did Reagan's trade war achieve? I'm showing you numbers there for the US trade deficit with Japan on the left-hand side, and as a percentage of American GDP on the right-hand side. It really didn't help very much. US trade deficit with Japan got much, much bigger under Reagan. Maybe it would have got even bigger if he didn't do his protectionism. But my point here is that this is something we've been through before. It didn't stop Japan selling more to America. What did begin to change, you can barely see it on the left-hand chart, is a little dip up where the US trade deficit did get a bit smaller after 1985. Why was that? It was to do with the currency. This is euro-dollar since 1975. On average, euro-dollar has been about 119. At the time of the Plaza Accord, this is a synthetic euro. There obviously was no euro in 1985, but a synthetic euro tells us that dollar-euro is at 0.65. Super strong dollar. The dollar began to weaken from 85 to 1990, and the consequence of that was the American trade deficit got smaller. It was actually dollar weakness that started to help with the US. There was one big country which suffered from that. That was Japan. Japan's currency had been strengthening since 1971. Between 1985 and 1990, it went from 240 yen to nearly 120 yen in 5 years. That massive strength of the Japanese currency, and by the way, China, since 2005, has been copying that Japan story. From 1985 to 1990, that strength of the yen led to lower interest rates in Japan, a property bubble in Japan, and then Japan's economy blew up in 1990 and has never recovered. And when I was in Beijing talking to the People's Bank of China in 2011, as long ago as that, they were frightened by this story. They were frightened that one day America would put pressure on China to strengthen its currency dramatically, and that would blow up the Chinese economy. So my base case is we can manage the trade wars. Trump talks big. He doesn't deliver as much. My base case is this is not going to ruin the world economy, but I am watching these exchange rates. And we've got a fantastic panel here to discuss these issues. And what I want to ask people to address is, firstly, am I wrong? Is the trade war actually a bigger threat than I'm saying? Is it going to be more significant? And secondly, if I am wrong, what has your institution done to prepare for these trade wars? And then thirdly, feel free to add any comments. What we'll try and do is keep each comment to about 3 or 4 minutes, and then open up to questions from you at the end, or have a discussion. If I can start with you, James, we're going to come down this way. Are ratings at the moment being impacted by the threat of trade wars? What do you think?
I guess the short answer to that is no, which would imply that sort of agree with you that up to where we are now, this is not something that's changing our view of global growth or even any particular country's growth. But I think the risk is there. It just hasn't materialized yet. So when we think about the root causes of protectionism and the risk of protectionism and the risk of things getting worse, I mean, one of the things that one of the conclusions we've tentatively come to is that this is tied up to some degree with the whole populist political movement that we're kind of familiar with in Europe and also in the US with the election of Mr. Trump. And part of that agenda, or part of that momentum, we think, is related to income distribution and people feeling like they've been left behind and looking for politicians to sort of do something about that. And the easy do something is always to blame foreigners. It's always somebody else's fault. Rather than address any issues that might be going on at home, it's always easier to blame, whether it's the Chinese or previously the Japanese. And that's in some ways sort of the easy way out. Interestingly, you know, in preparing for this panel, I was doing a little bit of reading about sort of the history of protectionism. I came across this paper from the mid-1990s by Danny Roderick, and he looked at the correlation between openness of economies and size of government. Because we always think about small open economies being very liberal, you know, relatively small government, which is true in Hong Kong and Singapore. But what he displayed or demonstrated was a correlation between economic openness and the size of government. So the more open an economy is to international trade, what the tendency is the government is actually larger. The public sector is larger because there's an income redistribution function which governments play importantly in those economies. And so you don't have necessarily the unequal income issue which would rise to protectionism, which is kind of consistent with having an open economy. So I think there's probably still a lesson there that you know, many of the issues that you were looking at, bilateral trade balances, I think most economists would agree that bilateral trade balances between any two countries, completely meaningless number, doesn't tell you anything meaningful at all. But I think the underlying issues of income inequality and government's abilities to address those issues, those I think are going to be with us for a while. And those are going to potentially put pressure on issues like trade policy. So I don't think we're going to not be talking about this in sort of 2 years' time. This issue is probably going to be with us. I would agree with you that once we get into an exchange rate discussion, that changes everything. I don't think the Chinese will follow the Japanese in having their currency appreciate based on US pressure. I think they looked at that, as you say, with horror. I'm not sure that was the only issue that was happening in Japan, but we can circle back to that. So maybe I'll leave it there.
And Herr Gasser, Switzerland, is it prepared?
I don't know, I hope. No, I would like to pick up what just Mr. McCormick said with regard to that popular unease with regard to what's going on currently in the world. The technological development, the globalization, the lack of trust in government, but in the working of our system in general, the whole pace of change which has changed considerably. And of course, what really strikes me is the fact that despite growth, I mean our growth rates, not only with regard to Switzerland, but also with regard to other regions in the world, if you look back at it, they were not that bad. However, there is an unease in society which results into these kind of election results that we had to accept in Europe and elsewhere, and the reason for that is very difficult from my point of view to grasp. Is it just the fact, or the globalization as such? Is it just an elite theory that is a theory that is transmitted by the elite? Is it something that only few can share, and this is basically a zero-sum game, that many gain, or very few will get the most of the pie, and only very little, or the huge masses don't profit from globalization? Or is it just the fact that the whole system of meritocracy doesn't work anymore, so that the one who really aspires to succeed does not have the chance to succeed because he cannot grasp the opportunities and work with these opportunities in order to progress in life? And this leads to the results that we have on the election polls in Europe. And also this leads basically to the fact that that governments start more and more to protect what they call their strategic assets. And if we talk about trade war between the US and China, we need to be very careful, because if I look at the European Union, for example, the custom levy that they impose are considerable. So once you start to throw stones in the glass house, you need to be careful. So it's very easy to blame the US or China or whoever. It's probably more difficult to address the problem at home. And I can give you an example of this. And to come back to what Mr. McCormick said, I think the secret for success is that you need to remain your economic system as open as possible, because only if you really expose yourself to international competition, you really can remain on the edge. And this is how we try to adapt to the system. You have to be open, and you have to be ready to compete with others, and you should not build up protectionist walls. And this is exactly, from our point of view, what's currently happened all around the world. We are very much affected by the measures taken by the European Union with regards to its bilateral relation with Switzerland. I can give you an example. The financial sector, European financial sector, can export its products into Switzerland directly. It doesn't even need to have a physical presence in Switzerland. They can acquire their clients in Switzerland and provide their products within Switzerland, whereas Switzerland is not allowed to. And especially in the financial market sector, it's very easy to build up protectionist measures through international regulation. And this is a point that is really of great concern for us. So the only recipe that we see is to keep up the open markets and to keep up a competitive edge and a competitive economy. That's the first point. The second point that is very important, and to come back to what I said at the beginning, which we have the feeling that many members of the societies feel disadvantaged with regard to globalization. You have to adapt your educational system in order to enable each and everyone to grasp the opportunities that globalization provides to everybody. And it's not only university education that we need, but we also need vocational training. You need to be able to bring the population in a situation where they cope with the fast-changing environment. And I think that we succeeded in that quite well, in the sense that we remain competitive for many years already, although there was a general economic downturn. And this had to do with the educational system and with the fact that universities and private business work together very closely in order to remain competitive. And it had also to do with the fact that we were able, due to our educational system, due to our vocational training, to have everybody being able to participate in the fast-changing economic environment and to grasp these opportunities for themselves in order not to be lost, not to fall behind with regard to the developments. That's maybe my initial points that I wanted to make.
Alexei.
Right in the middle of one of these sensitive sectors, steel. Trump takes a lot of advice from his friends in the steel industry, which I'm sure you know. Our work suggests that the Russian minimum wage is now about $200 a month. South Africa, $300. This is the minimum okay. Wage. And South Africa, $300. Turkey, well, $550 last month, maybe $450 today. But still much more expensive. It looks to us that Russia's more competitive today than ever with the ruble where it is. steel, your sector should be doing great. Is your solution the Japanese solution? You build a factory inside America, and then Reagan doesn't worry too much, or in today, Trump doesn't worry. What's your response to these threats?
Thank you. I'd like to make, first of all, if I may, a couple of general comments about the situation. First of all, I don't understand personally a lot of complaints about unfair distribution of wealth because of globalization and global trade. We should not forget that we all owe globalization current quality of life, because if you look at China, for example, or many other countries, we see a huge race of wealth. A lot of people went out of poverty. China managed to reduce the percentage of people below the poverty level, living at below poverty level from 60% to 15% within 20 years. And it's very, very typical for many countries. And it was mainly due to trade, because of trade. We should not forget it. And I believe that largely quality of life of all of us today in developed and developing countries is achieved largely because of the freedom of trade and globalization. And always people tend to blame globalization for job losses. But if you look at statistics, 3/4 or 90% of jobs were lost because of technology, because of new inventions. And it's coming more and more. And we are observing now rapid speed of changes, which most probably will reinforce these processes, but not due to globalization. And we all remember what globalization means today when was a nuclear problem in Japan during a catastrophe on nuclear station. And let's say, became clear that for example, it was just one factory in this area which was affected and stopped production, and it was responsible to manufacture chips for gearbox for many automakers in the world. I've spoken to CEO of Volkswagen, and he said they have in a storage yard inventories of these chips for 3 weeks of operation. It was a serious threat that they would stop the operation. It was typical for many European producers just because of it. And it's a reflection of competitiveness which we have in the world now. If we speak about the, you asked the question, shall we treat it seriously? Shall we believe it's a big deal or small deal? I don't know, just because it has started to evolve. But we don't know, and we can't predict the ripple effect. And especially if we are talking about the reciprocities and retaliations from major trade partners like European Union and many others, it could lead to huge trade war. And if we try to withdraw some lesson from 80s, from tension between Japan and US, it's questionable whether it's correct, because relative size of economies, Japan and US at that time was very different from China and US today. And Japan was strategic, political, even military partner of US, which is not the case exactly in situation between US and China now. It could trigger huge trade war with unpredicted results. And if everybody will stop or try to stop import, try to facilitate export, it could be a huge problem for all of us. And well, I believe we should do all our best and at least speak up our voice in order to defend our quality of life from this threat. If you speak about steel industry, if you speak about our company, Severstal, which is also exposed to these anti-dumping, these import duties from US, it's not a big problem for us directly. We have exported just 3% of our total output last year to US. We easily have redirected it, but in general, we could have big distortion in global steel trade, which might lead to big problems for our company as well. If you speak about the potential, how to say, solutions through the establishing of outlets in the United States, for example, we see that now several Russian big steel companies have branches in US. But they are equally exposed because current measures didn't distinguish between finished steel and semis, and all of the outlets are dependent upon the semis imported from Russia, and it is stopped equally like any finished steel as well. It doesn't help, at least in this case yet. What we can do about it, I don't know. Actually, what I have in mind only probably, well, again, to appeal to the global community to speak up their voice. We have a very famous bird case, for example, in 2000, when in 2000 was, this bird clause was introduced in legislation in the US in 2000 and abolished in 2006, exactly because of protests of major trade partners of US in WTO. Actually, it undermines, and what has happened in this case, it's even more dangerous than before. Why? Because of two reasons, I believe. Number one, it undermines, in my view, very much, if not completely, the global trade system. Because, well, we all know that WTO is quite weak today. But if, it happens again, and in such manner, it could undermine completely desire of nations to sit together and talk about trade. And it could be a big disaster, and we could pay this bill, all of us, very substantially. What also was introduced in this specific aluminium and steel duties, in this case in the United States, it was done not because of trade distortions elimination. It was not anti-dumping duties. It was duties justified by national security reasons. And it opens Pandora box for everybody because, look, if you could justify import duties for steel and aluminium by national security, all countries have this tool in their pocket. National security became a very popular topic now. And also, there is an interesting consequence. When the European Union appealed to the court of WTO about this, immediate reaction of the US representative at WTO was, it's not in the jurisdiction of WTO because it's national defense. It's national security. Well, we are opening Pandora box. All in all, I'd like to encourage all of us to be more decisive and to do more, how to say, conscious collective actions through WTO mechanism to convince US administration to stop it because it could be a huge problem. And last small comment. I was very cheered by Mr. McCormick's conclusions that the size of government leads to the liberalization of national economy. Looking at the size of Russian government and dynamic which we observed last decade, I hope we'll have more and more liberal regime in my country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Pavel Kadochnikov.
Thank you very much. Alexei started to speak English, but I'd better switch Russian because most of the audience are Russians. На самом деле,
well, actually, for the last few years, we are feeling concerned about globalization because before 2011, world trade increased 2 times more than world GDP, but for the last 7 years, the rates were less than world GDP. So all discuss was it the end of globalization or something will go differently or the interest will be reconsidered. But actually, in 2018, something happened that gave us optimism that, again, world trade is increasing 1.5 times faster than world GDP. That means globalization is alive and continues to expand. And that's not very stable equilibrium. And what Trump administration is doing is disrupting this equilibrium. That means we can lose jobs and wealth in the future. If we don't sustain it, we may go down into economic problems and then domestic political problems in most countries because most economies are involved in international trade. Second important comment is that protectionism is not what we find out from Twitter. It's a more serious story that started a long time ago and actively developing. Because with globalization expanding regarding tariffs, the situation is quite developed. Countries trade with 1.6%. Average tariff developed with emerging with an average tariff slightly more than 2. So it's open economy. Regarding non-tariff measures, WTO monitors, and the list was 3,200. So was tariff quotas anti-dumping. In 2017, there are more than 12,000. So that's the situation with protectionism we have now. For many years, we write in G20 and all international forums, and Alexei represents Business 20. They desire of all leaders to fight protectionism, but it continues to grow every year. So that's a big problem, and the roots is that we could not reconsider the role of developed and developing countries in the world. We could not agree upon in WTO, and we stopped negotiation process. We don't know how to make this well international institutional conditions. Of course, the dispute of China and United States is important and creates global risks, and I agree with my colleagues. But again, we need to differentiate what makes this dispute and what we hear from discussions, because very drastic steps, and there was joint statement by results of American and Chinese. There is no word about metal. There are no numbers. There's unclear obligations of China to buy more energy products and food that would negatively impact Russian producers and Russian exports, but how to institutionalize it, it's not clear. Whether we need to destroy WTO, or it's a hope for Trump pressure on Chinese state companies. They will follow the statement, which is unlikely because China is a global economy. So I think this inability to agree that happened under the influence of potential deterioration of economic and trade conditions would be overcome, because world trade now is not the trade that used to be in the second half of last century. These are not only goods, commodities, services, and digital. We don't have new agreement on WTO. No agreement on digital. That means that in this part, countries are free to behave themselves as aggressive and make any efforts from starting from blocking websites to banning American companies' operation in their markets. That means that pointed strikes would make these protectionists feel and make them able to agree.
From Singapore's perspective, actually, a trade war would do nobody any good. Everybody would be harmed by a trade war. Partly because I think a stable environment, a good economic integration actually brings benefits to everybody in the entire value chain. And the reflection of this is that today the global economic structure is so integrated. Technology is pushing boundaries such that physical boundaries no longer matter as much as before. We are more digitally connected. The consumers demand connectivity, and e-commerce, as you can see, is also rising. So technology is bringing people closer together, bringing down barriers. So to put up barriers to prevent free flow of information, free flow of people, goods, and services is actually going against what the trend of technology is causing us to do. It's going against what the consumer demands. And companies actually seek technology to make themselves much more competitive, whether it is bringing the productivity level one notch or two higher than your competitors to make sure you have a good value proposition to the market and to your consumers. So I think a trade war, by trying to disintermediate and put up barriers, goes against the trend of what the world is heading. And I think it's important that we continue to have a rules-based, multilateral trading system that is open, that is inclusive, that gives people clarity and transparency, so that a rising tide actually will float all ships at the same time. And I think in that sense, it is important to make sure that we have well-balanced economic policies that is coupled with sound domestic policies to create inclusive growth. And this must be driven by strong political leadership to make sure that as economy progresses, we don't leave behind a social underclass. But the bigger threat is not just a trade war. It's actually a disruption that is posed by technology. Today, with increased digitalization, there is a risk of a digital divide and a digital underclass, apart from just a social underclass. And I think there is importance for every government to realize that you cannot externalize these problems and blame it on someone else. You have to have good, sound domestic policies to make sure that as technology transforms the way we live and business are conducted, the benefits of technology transformation, the benefits of economic growth must filter down to the man on the street to make sure that underclass does not develop. So what are we going to do about it in Singapore? We take a hard look at our economy and we see technology trends as an important challenge for our companies and for our people. So over the last year, we have looked at our economy. We divide our industry sectors into 23 industrial transformation maps. Map our industry one by one into 23 different sectors. These 23 sectors comprise 80% of our GDP production. And by having a customized plan for each of the industry sectors, we look at transforming them by helping our companies to gain capability through technology adoption, helping our workers to gain skills of tomorrow, not just skills of today. The aim is to make sure that as companies transform, technology continues to disrupt the business models, our people are able to hold on to jobs that will come on stream. Old jobs will be lost, but new jobs will be created, and to ensure that we do not have, well, to put it bluntly, a rust belt forming in Singapore. And that helps us to hopefully cope with the changes and the challenges that will come. And with that, we hope to minimize a domestic pressure to be populist, to go onto the same bandwagon of protectionism. Singapore's economy, 2/3 of our economy is actually external facing. So if we were to be protectionist, we literally would destroy our economy. 3.5 times our GDP is based on external trade. So for us, being open and connected is important. Apart from addressing our domestic demands and constraints and putting in place measures to help our companies and our workers, we try and play an active international role by ensuring that Singapore continues to support open and free trade. So you would know that we are one of the earliest supporters of the TPP, which now is called the Comprehensive and Progressive Partnership for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP. We are a signatory of that. As a member of ASEAN, and being the ASEAN chair this year, we are actively promoting greater integration within ASEAN to ensure that the 10 countries of ASEAN continue to integrate further based on our vision to be a single effective market of 620 million today, with a projected GDP growth of 5.3% for the next 5 years, which, if everything goes well in terms of development, by 2030 we will be the 4th largest single bloc economically in the world, behind the EU, US, and China. And I think this kind of concept of integration, of working together for mutual good, is what we want to promote. As a responsible member of the international community, we continue to support free trade, and by bringing ASEAN and our +6 partners to work towards the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that integrates 10 countries of ASEAN with our +1 partners, 6 of them, China, India, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. So together we will form a 16-country economic bloc when the RCEP comes to pass, hopefully over the next year or two. We are working very hard to get our partners all on board. I think we want to send the signal that actually free trade, multilateral engagements is a useful thing that will bring economic benefits to all economies, big and small. So this is how we see ourselves playing a useful role to continue to push for a rule-based international multilateral trading order. Thank you.
Frank, please.
Thank you very much. Perhaps at the beginning I would like to add some to the global perspective, because there's something which is called Global Trade Alert, which is published on an annual basis. And for 2016, the organization which publishes this has, let's say, looked into 770, let's say, trade measures being taken by countries. And out of them, 570 had a discriminatory or protectionist effect, while only 200 of them had a liberalizing effect. I think this shows something about, let's say, the global mood with regards to free trade, or let's say development anyway of world trade. Second, coming to the US, I mean, lots of things have been said about the Trump administration and let's say their way of dealing with protectionist measures. From our point of view as Association of European Business representing business interests of European investors here in Russia, certainly we also observe this because we have seen now that in the energy sector the Americans are taking measures which have direct implications for the European economy. And if we look, for example, at the question, steel has already been mentioned, but aluminium, for example, it seems to be, let's say, that with these measures which have been taken in the sanctions field, that this also has a protectionist character in the end. And here you ask yourself, is it, let's say, something which is motivated political actions or whatsoever, or is it rather something which has a protectionist taste to it? And here I would say that, let's say, if we look especially into the latest sanctions against Russia and against Iran, which have been taken by the American administration or are on the way, it has, or we can say that in the end, these sanctions are perhaps a unconventional, let's say, protectionist measure for the US economy. And this is certainly something which is very worrying. Now let's say something about Russia, because we are here in Russia, and certainly also Russia has one or the other problem, because if we look into the track record of Russia in WTO, it's not such a good one, because there were quite a number already of disputes which have been resolved by WTO in the past 2 years. The recycling fee for cars, as an example, let's say the imports of pork and pigs into Russia, which have created some disputes with the European Union, and a number of other things. And here certainly I have to say that also in Russia there seems to be a tendency to answer to certain challenges of the world economy and of the competitive situation of the country with protectionist measures. We can see that currently on the Eurasian Economic Union level, where we have a case of anti-dumping against virtually every company from outside of Russia in the field of crop protection, which seems to be a strange thing that it's with every of these companies. And this doesn't really help, from our point of view, the development of free exchange between the European Union, which is the largest trading partner of Russia, by the way, by far, and Russia itself. We certainly see other protectionist measures, like the access of foreign companies to tenders from state structures or state-owned companies, and here in Russia, state-owned companies are a large share of the GDP. And if we look into, let's say, the general situation of Russia, you will see, if you compare it, for example, with a country which has been mentioned, which is Mexico, you can see that Russia, generally speaking, is a country with very few free trade agreements. Which is saying something about, I think, the philosophy of Russian external trade relations. I understand now that also through the Eurasian Economic Union, the free trade agreements are being negotiated. I think this is good, because you need to increase competition. You need to increase your exchange, your commerce, your trade with other countries in order to increase welfare. Last comment which I want to make, I mean, so you can say that these measures don't have a real, let's say, major effect for the whole world economy. But now I'm a historian by education, and I see, let's say, if I look into the history of the 20th century, for example, that there is a relationship between, let's say, commercial disputes, trade wars in the end, and armed conflicts. And I wouldn't, let's say, be alarmist about it, but anyway, certainly there is an interconnection between these things, and we have to be very careful not to come in a downward spiral, which is then very, let's say, difficult to stop at some point. And again, as a historian, I understand that everything goes wrong, what can go wrong, if you don't do the right things in the right moment. Thank you.
We've heard about Singapore with its new trade arrangements and a suggestion that maybe Russia could do more. But this is not the finance ministry's role exactly, so feel free to say what you will. Sergey.
So I will follow the examples of my colleagues who will speak in English. Very interesting to watch people most people do not use any iPhones, either people speak in English or in Russian. So it's globalization taking place already here. So my proposal is to look at the situation from different point of view. There's close link between global debt, global trade and global debt. If you have restrictions on trade, I wonder who will going to pay debt. So maybe people took notice that recent IMFC communique used for the first time in recent history the slogan global debt. So legally it sounds a bit strange, but if we look into the situation from economic or financial point of view, we really see there's a big issue to be afraid of in terms of further development. If we have restrictions on trade, how countries will earn currencies to repay debt? Just one figure, OECD sovereign debt now stands for 43 trillion, trillions, not billions, trillions of US dollars. Half of them, of this figure is the liabilities of United States government. So restrictions, counter restrictions, sanctions, counter sanctions, and we will face very serious debt situations. My question is very simple. What events can trigger the debt crisis? So we managed somehow overcome difficulties in terms of correspondent banking. I hope people familiar this correspondent banking crisis, which started somewhere after the 2010, have been overcome somehow, but it had big influence on trade. So now we have the trade grows 2 times or 1.5 times quicker than global growth, meaning that the economic cycle is stronger than political wishes of some leaders. It's true, but for how long? But coming back to the debt issue and linkage with these very strange tendencies to put on protectionist measures or restrictions. I think in working in this field, United States government is working against a number of global tendencies which are developing on the debt markets, global debt markets. I just mentioned 3 of them. First, the increased role of retail investors, or retail creditors, as you may put it. The second, increased role as investors' mutual funds. Second, the increased role of trade with the computers programs with assistance of robots. And another trend linked to the indexes. Yeah, maybe I already said it. So investment in indexes, and that this very complicated instrument, and this where retail investors mostly involved in, is worth of almost 12 trillion. So what are the threats? The threats are comes, in my opinion, from the secondary sanctions. The secondary sanctions are very difficult to predict how they influence the behavior of investors. So in February, we already have a big drop on financial markets because of the computer trading stimulated the drop in the prices. And we see that from nothing, markets volatility increased, liquidity decreased, and things like this. So to conclude, I believe that biggest threats to global growth comes from the restrictions on financial markets. We're still waiting for concrete measures in the field of global trade. this mostly what's not right now. But on financial markets, we have real actions already taken. And when you have this global debt, it is very serious for global economy, not only for Russia, Iran, Venezuela, or things like this. No one knows really what would be the trigger of the debt crisis in the absence of sovereign debt restructuring mechanism. It still does not exist, and we will face really big problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ksenia, has the central bank done enough? Floating currency, responsible monetary policy, excellence, Lagarde called central bank policy yesterday. Have you done enough?
Well, thank you very much, Charles, for your question. It seems to be an English-speaking panel, so sorry to Pavel, I'll continue in English. Well, let me go back to protectionism first. And while protectionism is not a win-win game, it is a zero-sum game, right? So it's definitely bad for growth globally. Maybe some countries win, but overall the effect on growth is usually negative. This time around, it may be more pronounced than in the Reagan era, actually. Because in the Reagan era, I think Alexei spoke about that, we didn't have global value chains or production chains. Right, globalization was much more limited than it is today, and the disruptive effect of protectionism efforts was much smaller than it is today, and maybe much more predictable than it is today because of this globalization which happened for the last almost 40 years already. So this is one thing. Second thing, well, let us look at the problem from the macroeconomic perspective. And from the macroeconomic perspective, trade policy, protectionism, is not the best tool, if even is not the tool at all, to correct global imbalances and trade deficit. Well, it looks natural, right, from some micro perspective that if you use a tool which has a direct impact on something, is the most effective tool. It's not. From the macroeconomic perspective, of course, well, if we speak of the United States, it's fiscal package, right? It's fiscal expansion will have an effect on its trade balance. It will further increase its trade and current account deficits. Something would happen during the Reagan era as well, right? And because of that, protectionism will not be as effective as it's supposed to be. And as a macroeconomist, we, well, always have to take this into consideration. And this is why, of course, exchange rate policies, right, becoming a worry right now, where we will see more and more blames of manipulation of currencies and things like this in different countries, not only in the United States. But anyway, what is the effect of all those trade tensions on the financial markets and on the exchange rate so far? The effect is, of course, increase of volatility, right? And while this is worrying by itself, and it may necessarily not be good for growth anyway. Well, what is the proper response from the central bank? As you said, flexible exchange rate allows us countries to adapt to any external shocks as fast as possible. Maybe not as easy as possible, but as fast as possible. And this is why we here in Russia switch to flexible exchange rate and stick to flexible exchange rate regime. However, from the financial stability perspective, we still may need some instruments, and the Central Bank of Russia has a whole range of such instruments. You know, we occasionally have to provide for some short period of time, some effects on the swap market, that's to allow markets to work smoothly without creating any discrepancies. In 2015, we provide some effects through FX repo operations and FX credit, and that was a tool which allowed and helped the economy and financial markets to adjust to the new situation. So we have this whole range of instruments, and we are ready to use it if needed to decrease the negative effect of volatility and financial stability on financial markets and on economic adjustments. Thank you.
Andy, 4 or 5 minutes maybe?
Okay. Yeah, I think that a lot of other panelists have spoken a lot about what is good, what is bad. I maybe first focus on my prediction. I've been writing about this for a while. I think that in the short term, meaning this year, next year, a real trade war is not likely. The Deputy Governor just mentioned the one reason I believe in is that this time it's not like Japan. In the 80s, Japanese were selling something Japanese, everything made in Japan. In the case of China, it's really supply chain. The profits are in the United States and the production is in China. So it's much not easy to deal with that. So this is one reason. The other reason is that the U.S. economy is doing relatively well right now. So why do you want to rock the boat? I think that doesn't make sense. Also, the United States has a lot of bubbles. If you rock the boat, the risk premium goes up, all the bubbles pop. You have like a huge bond market bubble, huge stock market bubble, and the valuation of the stock market is 100% above historical average. Then you have a huge, gigantic Silicon Valley bubble. You look around and people talk about the whole internet changing the world, digitalization, all that crap. You look at the economic impact, we see zero. All these Silicon Valley geniuses have had a zero impact on the global economy. So it's just a huge bubble, all due to what? Low interest rate, too much money supply. So you basically, all those guys, basically, Elon Musk is a bubble, trust me. No, so basically, when it pops, and all those guys go down. So I don't really, I don't think that, you look at Trump like looks dangerous, but he's not as dangerous as he looks, because he thinks aloud, and when he thinks, he tweets. So makes you very nervous. But when he thinks again, the guy it chickens out, you see. He chickens out every time. So I don't really believe that in the short term, there will be a real trade war. And the other thing is that during the midterm election in November, if the Democrats win the Congress, and they'll impeach him, and he'll go to jail. He knows that. So he's afraid of going to jail, right? So this is the sort of, I think that short term is not likely. But over time, it's very serious. You look at the US economy, it's at the peak of the cycle. The fiscal deficit is 5% of GDP. Interest rate is 1.some%. This is at the peak of the cycle. In the previous cycle peaks, you would have fiscal surplus. Interest would be like 6%. So when the economy goes down, you can cut interest rate, you can increase the fiscal deficit. But at this time, when the economy goes down, it's going to be really bad. There are no tools. Because of and if they cut interest rate, increase fiscal deficit, the dollar will collapse. So the United States, during the next cycle down, the Americans will have a huge, very difficult time. And I think that the United States will lash out. Now, you look at the last 40 years, the wage growth has been like a zero, basically zero, like 0.2%. And most people, living standard has not increased. And you look at the education cost. Higher education cost has basically quadrupled. So an average working class family in the Midwest could not send their children to college anymore. So they are trapped. These generations have no hope. There's no hope for the next generation. So I think that this is a very dire situation, and they could have lashed out. But who's to blame? Now you blame Chinese? I've been watching these for like a long time. It's basically it's not any one guy's fault. You look at Americans, they are in this situation because Americans love to have a good time. They want to spend money, spend it. Every time the economy is going down, they say, what's the solution? Spend more money. Then they buy all these trinkets made in China. Then what do? Nothing. They throw everything into basement. Then the basement is full. What do? They build another basement to create another housing bubble. So life is total waste. Why would you want to have like another phone every year? This is just crazy. You have a better phone, then you have more opportunity to kill time, right? So you're always looking at the phone. What's the point? So this is a set of we need a behavioral change, right? We need a really behavioral change. So how are we going to change your behavior? No, I'm not saying Chinese are not at fault. Chinese kind of love to make money. So it's the opposite of the United States. So we need both sides to change.
Thank you very much. I could listen to you for an hour. But I would also love to hear from our other two panelists. Alexei Yakovitsky, CEO of VTB, please.
Thank you. Speaking of bubbles, I want to briefly talk about implications of this rise in protectionism, provided you're right, on the financial sector, on financial markets, specifically on emerging markets. You mentioned the big threat that is coming from all this, from China and subsequently emerging markets. I think there are two major implications here. One is it is obvious that emerging markets, even larger ones like Russia, can no longer rely on Western capital markets and Western financial sector infrastructure for the development of their capital markets and their financial sector. It's not a secret that many countries at a certain period of time, even Russia, effectively outsourced the bulk of the liquid capital flows and the bulk of the financial sector infrastructure, whether that's clearing houses, investment banks, exchanges, listing practices, to the Western capital markets. The growing restrictions and the general change in the EMDM fund flows and the effectively almost a destruction of the very notion of emerging markets as an asset class that is kind of ongoing, even though that may not be totally obvious at this stage, dictates the need for every major emerging market to start building their own infrastructure domestically and develop domestic capital markets in a very accelerated fashion. Russia has been somewhat in the forefront here, not because it saw what's coming earlier, plainly because of the sanctions pressure that started a few years ago, which and it kind of manifested itself even more profoundly this year with the latest wave of sanctions, when it became clear that the vulnerability of the financial markets, of the capital flows, the dependence on international investors and the global investors for a lot of the market capitalization and the fund flows is somewhat excessive. The same applies to the financial markets infrastructure. So what is definitely coming, and we as Russia's largest investment bank are focused on, is, if you will, localization of the infrastructure and accelerated development of the financial markets. Domestically, what's clearly helping is in the environment of low interest rates in Russia, you have deposit or real estate as a major savings instrument for the broader population is no longer attractive. So you are seeing a lot of average investors moving away from traditional instruments and going into into financial instruments, into bonds and equities. On top of it, you clearly see a lot of Russian capital coming back because of the sanctions pressure and general geopolitical pressure that is, and it's finding its new home in Russia, and this can't help but develop a domestic investor base. And this partly explains the relative stability that we saw in the market. Both in the equity and debt markets in the last 12 months, despite major deteriorations in terms of the news flow. The second implication that I wanted to mention, and speaking of protectionism, it actually hasn't started with Trump coming to power and doing a few things that the previous speaker spoke about so eloquently. If you will, banking sector regulation that started to change and tighten so drastically following the collapse 10 years ago was actually an early example, and if you look at it as an early example of protectionism, because effectively what Western banks and Western regulators have done is they've effectively told their banks to stop taking risk, excessive risk, and obviously markets that got hit very significantly with the emerging markets. So you effectively deprived, or you started to deprive many emerging markets of relatively cheap liquidity and relatively cheap funding that was coming from excessively risky and excessively accommodating regulation of the previous era. Now the response to this and the consequence of this has been, if you will, the deglobalization of the banking sector. There are way fewer banks now than there were 10 years ago that you can call global these days. The first victims of big banks getting out of riskier asset classes and riskier geographies were obviously emerging markets, whether that's Africa, whether that's Russia to some extent, which actually created opportunities for regional players, for national players such as ourselves, to tap into some of the opportunities that did not exist before, to try and look at certain markets and certain products that were the domain and they were the dominant products of the banks. So the important opportunity, and I think kind of answering the very early question you posed, I don't think protectionism is coming and it will rule the world, but certain dislocation in the market and the displacement of certain markets is definitely coming, whether that's in the real sector or in the financial sector. And clearly the fragmentation of the banking sector, greater nationalization meaning kind of greater share of national banks in major markets, less international cross-border financial flows in terms of the banking sector. That's clearly what's coming, and that is actually an opportunity for many of the emerging markets banks, whether you're coming from India or China or Russia, to play a bigger role across EM. Thank you.
We are running low on time, but ideally we'll get one question from the audience as well. But first, of course, Mr. Fugan, please give your thoughts on.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I would like to start with a very well-known Apple company example. Apple explore technologies to create smartphones, iPads, and so on, and move the production based on these technologies to some other countries, to China first of all. As a result, China got some additional employment and some sort of compensation of these people, the wealth. Second, profit were transferred to the Apple. Also, it's positive. But most significant result is that actually, because through this approach, the price of smartphones is lower than it could be in case if all these iPhones will be created in the United States. As a result, market is bigger, and people given with more opportunities to use this technology in ordinary life. So it's very positive. Yes, it's very difficult to find some, let's say, negative effect of this general decision. But why politicians still is trying to use protectionism and some steps against globalization in domestic own policies? It's quite it's easy answer is to say that because it's a populist approach, because this is a domestic political problems which politicians would like to solve through the, let's say, some sort of free trade, anti-global decisions. I'm not sure that actually the problem is that actually, what does it mean globalization? Usually when we're talking about globalization, we understand that this is a free trade and to some extent free movement of capital accounts. I mean the investment and free flows of financial flows. But actually we didn't take into account that there is a domestic regulation which actually can seriously influence to these free trade terms and free investment terms. First of all, for example, subsidies. Okay. Second, restriction for the labor movement, movement between borders. Second, and we can continue actually, recognition of educational licenses, recognition of domestic licenses for different type of activities, for example, financial institution and so on. Ecology regulation. So if you take into account that actually in this area of regulation there is a big differences in different countries. I forgot to mention exchange rate. You can manipulate with exchange rate and to create much more powerful effect for free trade terms than tariffs. Because you can, for tariffs, you can easily answer to by the tariffs. If somebody is trying to tariff me, I can tariff him. Okay, and common sense actually usually keep these attempts in some reasonable boundaries. So actually without some sort of regulation of domestic approaches, it's very difficult to create for a long-term period of time really free trade terms across the world. Anytime it will be some attempts of politicians, local politicians, to create some privileges for domestic local companies just because there is a big differences in domestic regulations. So actually there are no easy answer how to deal with trade wars, how to deal with some restrictions of investment between countries. There are no easy answer. This answer simply does not exist. The only what actually politician has to do to keep themselves in some sort of more or less reasonable rules and to avoid behavior of elephant in China-born store. That's it.
We have got 2 minutes, I think, until the end of the session. So, okay, I'll take one question, if that's okay with everyone. We'll take one question if there is anyone who burning need to ask. Otherwise, I will sum up. I see no burning need. I think this panel has been amazing. I've learned a lot, and I'm going to have to write a paper about it. I can't sum it all up. My Japan example, not perfect. Japan was a partner of America, China potentially an enemy, and it could be worse. But the value chain connection means I find it hard to understand how America can really pursue a trade war. We've heard that trade is good. Trade creates wealth. Thank you very much for that. It's a good reminder. That openness, as pursued by Singapore, has delivered wealth, and that should be something we're in support of. I learned a lot. I hope you did too. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the panel for joining us.